When I first noticed the letter, nothing out of the ordinary, just a stack of mail, junk, bills, a magazine, and then an official-looking envelope, the kind that always comes with a red stamp on it. I recognized the address immediately, Simmons Valley HOA. My stomach sank. HOA letters had never been a problem before. They sent the occasional reminder about grass height or holiday decorations, standard stuff. But this one felt different. The letter was too thick for the usual notices. I could already tell there was something serious inside. I tore open the envelope and scanned the letter quickly. Final notice, non-compliance with HOA regulations. Immediate fine of $2,500. I blinked. Twice. $2,500? For what? I flipped through the pages, looking for an explanation, a justification. But there was nothing concrete. No photos of violations. No specific descriptions of what I'd done wrong. Just vague language about unauthorized parking and failure to comply with community standards. I checked the letter again, just to be sure. A fine for parking. I didn't even own a second car, much less park in any space that wasn't mine. I prided myself on being a law-abiding citizen, especially when it came to HOA rules. Confused, I set the letter down and took a deep breath. Something didn't add up. I couldn't let this slide. I had to get to the bottom of what was going on. So I decided to attend the next HOA meeting, whether they liked it or not. The meeting was held in the community center, a drab room with fluorescent lights and folding chairs that looked like they hadn't been replaced since the 90s. I could already tell that the Simmons Valley HOA board had all the charm of a used car dealership. They were sitting at the front of the room, behind a long table, shuffling papers like they had all the power in the world. I made my way to the front, my letter in hand, and took a seat toward the back. As the meeting began, Karen Whitmore, the HOA president, stood up to speak in her usual self-important tone. I couldn't help but roll my eyes when she called the meeting to order. She went on about neighborhood aesthetics and compliance, with a smugness that almost made it seem like she owned the entire community. When it came time for open discussion, I stood up, letter in hand, and asked to speak. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm here about a fine I received. A $2,500 parking violation fine for something I can't even figure out. I've looked through the HOA rules, and there's no mention of what I'm being fined for." Karen gave me a tight smile, her eyes glinting with that unearned confidence. "Oh, that? Yes, well, your vehicle was parked in a visitor's space for more than 48 hours without a permit. It's clearly a violation of our parking policy." I blinked. A visitor's space? I don't even have a second car. Her smile didn't waver. "I'm afraid the HOA's decision is final. The fine is being imposed to maintain the integrity of our neighborhood." I sat down, feeling a pit form in my stomach. Something felt off. There was no clear record, no notice or photos to back up the claim. It was just her word against mine. I couldn't just let them get away with it. As a personal injury lawyer, I knew how to spot inconsistencies and misuse of authority. And there were a lot of red flags here. I waited until the end of the meeting, and then quietly made a mental note to dig deeper into the HOA's parking regulations, because I had a feeling this wasn't about parking at all. As I walked out of the meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A $2,500 fine for something that seemed so minor, with no evidence or clear violation. This wasn't just about parking. The next morning, I sat down at my desk, a cup of coffee in hand, and started doing what I knew best, digging into records. As a personal injury lawyer, I had a knack for investigating fraudulent claims and spotting inconsistencies. But as an IRS auditor, I knew how to sift through paperwork like it was second nature. This wasn't going to be any different. I pulled out the HOA's official parking regulations. The rules were vague at best. There was a mention of visitor spaces, but it said nothing about restrictions for residents parking there. It simply stated that visitors should park in designated spaces and residents should avoid parking in these spaces for extended periods. That didn't seem like a rule worth the $2,500 fine. So I requested the HOA's records from the last 3 months, focusing on parking-related fines. They hesitated, but legally, they had to comply. The documents arrived a few days later, more than 30 pages of fines, fees, and emails, all printed out and stapled in a neat stack. I started to go through the paperwork systematically, and immediately I found a huge discrepancy. The fines were being issued in consistent amounts. Some fines for violations were $100, others for much smaller issues were as high as $5,000. But in my case, the fine was $2,500, which didn't align with anything else. Then I came across something that made my stomach turn, a list of unpaid fines that had been marked as forgiven with no explanation, but not a single mention of the fines being reversed for anyone who had contested them. It didn't take long to put the pieces together. Karen, the HOA president, had been handing out excessive fines with no real legal backing, just to generate extra revenue for the HOA. I also found that several of the fines were directly related to landscaping violations, minor rule infractions, and nuisance complaints, none of which were even violations listed in the HOA's official regulations. And then I found the final kicker, a payment from the HOA to a mystery account made under the category of miscellaneous expenses. The payment was $2,500. It didn't take a genius to figure it out. This wasn't a coincidence. Karen had been running a money-making scheme, padding the HOA's finances by imposing unlawful fines and then funneling the money into a personal account. After going through the HOA's financial records, I felt like I'd stumbled upon the smoking gun. The $2,500 fine that had been levied against me was not an isolated incident. It was just one piece of a much larger, more sinister pattern of financial manipulation. I dug deeper, tracking down the payments from the HOA's account. The more I looked, the more I found. The $2,500 I was being fined was just the tip of the iceberg. There were multiple instances where the HOA had collected fines from residents without any formal warning or valid violation. And what really tipped the scales was the discovery that the HOA's unaccounted for payments then going into an account registered under Karen Whitmore's name. I took a screenshot of the bank transactions, focusing on the ones that matched the amount of my fine, $2,500. I had no doubt now. The fine was simply a way for Karen to inflate the HOA's finances and use the money to cover up her own financial discrepancies. I knew this was bad, but now I had irrefutable proof that the HOA had been operating illegally. This wasn't just about a parking violation anymore. It was about fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of power. My next step was obvious. I needed to take this public. I gathered the evidence, stacked it neatly in a folder, and texted my lawyer friend. I need you to help me draft an official letter. This HOA is not only breaking the law, they've been exploiting the entire neighborhood. I felt a strange sense of calm as I hit send. The battle was no longer just between me and the HOA. It was about ensuring that Karen and her cronies faced the consequences for their actions. The letter was ready, and so was I. I couldn't let Karen continue to abuse her position as HOA president. Not when I had all the evidence that could bring her down. Armed with the financial records, the illegal fines, and her personal involvement in fraudulent transactions, I knew it was time to act. I scheduled a private meeting with the HOA board. I wasn't sure how many of them were still loyal to Karen, but it didn't matter. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. I had to make sure everyone understood the truth and that the entire board knew they could no longer be complicit. As I walked into the meeting room, the board members exchanged awkward glances. I could see some of them looked nervous. Others seemed a bit too confident. They had no idea what was about to hit them. Karen was already at the head of the table, wearing her usual smug expression. But when she saw me walk in, her face twitched, and she sat up a little straighter. "Mr. Callahan," she said coolly, "I trust you're here to discuss your fine?" "I'm here to discuss more than that," I replied, my voice steady. "I'm here to discuss how you've been embezzling money from the HOA, issuing illegal fines to residents, and mismanaging the entire community's finances." Karen's smile faltered. She looked at the board members, then back at me, clearly trying to play it off. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice a little shakier than usual. "Everything the HOA has done is within our guidelines." I pulled out the folder of evidence and slid it across the table. The papers and screenshots spilled out, showing the fraudulent fines, the personal payments, and the illegal transactions that had gone into her personal account. I've been through the HOA's records. I've seen the payments you've funneled through to your account. And I've seen the false fines you've imposed on residents. You've been operating like this for months, and now you're going to pay for it. The room fell silent. The board members were staring at the papers, their faces going pale as they started to realize what was really happening. "Karen," I continued, "you've misled every single person in this neighborhood. And I'm not backing down." Karen's expression shifted from defiance to fear. "You can't do this. You're just one person. The HOA has the authority. No, Karen, I interrupted, leaning forward. The law has the authority. And you've been breaking it. As the silence in the room stretched on, I knew I had to press my advantage. The evidence was clear, and Karen knew she had nowhere to hide. But I wasn't just going to take down Karen. I needed to make sure the rest of the board understood they could be held accountable too. I stood up and looked around the room. I could feel the shift in the air. The board members were starting to get uncomfortable. They were looking at the documents, exchanging nervous glances, but no one was saying a word. That's when I decided to rally the residents. I sent out an email to every homeowner in the neighborhood. I detailed the situation, outlined fraudulent fines, and attached copies of the documents Karen had tried to sweep under the rug. I explained how the HOA had been violating their own bylaws and how residents had been wrongly fined for things that weren't even violations. The response was immediate. People began showing up at the next HOA meeting in droves. It was no longer just about me. It was about every single person in this neighborhood who had been bullied into paying fines for things they didn't do. The once quiet community was now awake and ready to fight back. When Karen walked into the meeting, she was met with a wall of residents staring at her, furious and fed up. The room was packed, and I saw a few board members shift uncomfortably in their seats as the crowd grew louder. I stood up again and addressed the board, speaking calmly, but with authority. We've come together today to take action. The evidence is clear, and we're not backing down, I said. Karen, you've made a lot of mistakes, and today you'll have to answer for them. Karen looked at me, then at the crowd, and I saw the realization hit her. She tried to regain control, but the room had turned. There was no turning back now. The residents had all the power. As the room filled with murmurs, the once dominant atmosphere in the HOA meeting shifted. Karen, who'd ruled with an iron fist for years, was now on the defensive, and it showed. Board members who had been her loyal supporters before were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact. They could see the tide was turning. The evidence was irrefutable, and they had no way of backing Karen without implicating themselves. I could feel the shift in energy. It was palpable. The residents were no longer just silent bystanders. They were empowered, standing up for themselves and demanding answers. And Karen couldn't handle it. She tried to speak again, but her voice wavered. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, fumbling for her notes. Before she could finish, I raised my hand to stop her. "I've heard enough. Karen, you've been abusing your power for months, probably longer. But the truth is out now, and no amount of talking is going to change that." The residents began nodding, some even applauding quietly. One neighbor stood up, holding a letter in his hand, and announced, "I've been wrongfully fined $3,000 for a fence that was approved by the board." How many others have been targeted like this? A few other residents echoed his sentiment, standing up and sharing their own stories of unfair fines, unexplained charges, and overbearing inspections. One by one, the voices grew louder, and Karen's mask of control began to crack. I turned back to the board, my voice firm. Karen's actions are not just mismanagement, they're illegal. You need to decide right now whether you want to go down with her or start doing what's right for this community. The other board members looked at each other, uncomfortable, knowing their loyalty to Karen might soon come at a heavy cost. I could see the fear in their eyes, and I knew I had them. The decision was no longer in Karen's hands, it was in ours. I stepped back, giving the board time to process. The room had gone from tense to charged with anticipation. They could either side with Karen and continue to protect her, or they could do the right thing and cut her loose before things spiral further. After what seemed like an eternity of silence, one of the board members, James Harper, the least vocal and most passive of the group, stood up. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his glasses, his voice low but clear. "Karen, I think it's time for us to take action," James said, his gaze flicking between Karen and the growing crowd of residents. "I've had some doubts about how things have been handled recently, but this is too far." I saw Karen's face go white. Her support was slipping fast, and she knew it. The rest of the board seemed to come to their senses, one by one, as if some invisible weight had lifted from their shoulders. Finally, Paul Green, another board member, spoke up. "We can't ignore this anymore, Karen," Paul said, his voice surprisingly strong. "We've been involved in actions that can't be explained away. I suggest we contact legal counsel immediately to review all of this." The room went dead quiet. Karen's eyes darted around the room, and her hands clenched into fists. For a moment, it felt like she was about to make a break for it, but the eyes of the entire community were on her, and she couldn't hide anymore. "You're making a huge mistake," she spat, looking at the board members. "I've been running this neighborhood for years. You think this is about a few fines?" I stood up slowly, letting the weight of my words hang in the air. "This is about a lot more than fines, Karen. This is about a pattern of fraud, mismanagement, and personal enrichment at the expense of your neighbors. And the fact that you're still trying to play it off shows exactly who you are." The rest of the board looked at each other and then turned to Karen. In an unprecedented move, they voted unanimously to suspend her from her position as HOA president, pending a full investigation into the financial records. One of the board members called the local authorities to formally request an audit of the HOA's activities. The residents cheered. Some even stood and clapped. I didn't feel the need to join in. I had already won. Karen had been exposed. But this wasn't just about Karen's removal from power. It was about showing the neighborhood that abuse of power wouldn't be tolerated. The legal consequences of her actions were about to hit her like a freight train. As the meeting ended, Karen stormed out of the room, her face beet red with fury. She shouted over her shoulder, "This isn't over. I'll fight this." I watched her leave unfazed. She could try to fight it all she wanted, but it was too late. The damage had been done. She'd been investigated. The ball was rolling, and there was no stopping it now. The following days were a blur of relief and celebration. The once oppressive weight that Karen's leadership had cast over the community seemed to evaporate overnight. Residents who had once kept their heads down in fear of fines, inspections, or Karen's wrath were now speaking up, coming together, and discussing how they could take back control of the neighborhood. The first thing the board did was hold a community-wide meeting. This time, it wasn't in the dimly lit tents room at the community center. No, they held it outdoors in the park, with fresh air and a real sense of unity. And when I showed up, I was greeted with handshakes, pats on the back, and even a few thank you cards from neighbors. "Thank you for doing what needed to be done," one woman said, her eyes full of gratitude. "I was terrified of Karen, and I know so many others were too. But you gave us hope." There were discussions of new bylaws that would make the HOA more transparent, with clear limits on fines and rules that would be voted on by the community, not just decided by a handful of board members. The new board members, some of whom had once been too scared to speak up, were now all about community involvement. Karen's exit was swift. She didn't fight the suspension. She didn't show up to the next meeting. The local authorities had already started their investigation into her financial practices, and she knew there would be legal consequences coming her way. She disappeared from the community, and though we never heard much more about her, I knew she wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. But the real celebration came a week later, when a local news station ran a feature on the case. "Community takes back control from corrupt HOA president," the headline read. The report showed clips of Karen's former reign, how she'd imposed fines on residents, and how the community had fought back, eventually removing her from power. My face was in the footage, just a regular homeowner turned whistleblower. The story spread, and more neighborhoods reached out to me for advice on how to hold their own HOAs accountable. And just as the final icing on the cake, I received a letter from the State HOA Regulatory Board. They had officially started investigating Karen's actions, and I was asked to be a key witness. I didn't have to do anything special, just give them the same evidence I'd already presented. But that felt like the final nail in her coffin. In the weeks following Karen's removal, the dominoes began to fall. What started as a personal vendetta against me had unintentionally unraveled a much larger, much more insidious network of corruption. It turned out Karen wasn't working alone. She had a few cronies on the board, and many of them were now facing their own investigations for illegal fines, fraudulent claims, and mismanagement of HOA funds. The State HOA Regulatory Board began sweeping through Simmons Valley's records with a fine-toothed comb. They found evidence of over $150,000 in unauthorized fees collected over the past year alone. Homeowners who had been wrongfully fined for minor infractions started receiving refunds, some of them substantial amounts, along with formal apologies. Meanwhile, I couldn't help but notice that the neighborhood was changing. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about taking back what we had lost, trust. I'd made a simple decision when I confronted Karen. I wasn't just fighting for my own property. I was fighting for every homeowner who felt powerless, for every neighbor who was too scared to speak up. And now we were all empowered. With the old regime gone, the new HOA board was like night and day. They were transparent, open, and eager to listen. They actively sought feedback from the residents before making any changes, something that had never happened before. One afternoon, as I was sitting on my porch, a few neighbors stopped by to thank me. They'd been part of the group that Karen had targeted, and they were genuinely grateful. "We never would have had the courage to stand up to her if it wasn't for you," one of them said, shaking my hand firmly. "You're the reason this neighborhood is finally free." It felt good. Better than I had expected. Because for the first time in years, we were in control of our own community. The changes were noticeable immediately. The air felt lighter, almost freer, as if a weight had been lifted from the community. The new board wasn't just interested in enforcing rules, they were interested in building a neighborhood that people were proud to live in. The first major change: community involvement. The new HOA board implemented quarterly town hall meetings, where every resident had the opportunity to voice concerns, suggest improvements, and ask questions. No more closed-door decisions. No more hidden agendas. Every decision was out in the open. As word spread about the new atmosphere, community pride grew. The long-abandoned community park. It was cleaned up, repainted, and reopened for everyone. Residents started planning neighborhood picnics, holiday gatherings, and even movie nights in the park. One Saturday afternoon, I was walking my dog when I saw a group of neighbors gathered at the park, organizing the first-ever neighborhood cleanup. People of all ages were picking up litter, planting flowers, and fixing up the playground. I could hear laughter and the sound of conversations about shared goals, about creating something better. I approached a group of people near the swing set and stopped to chat. One neighbor said, "Before all this with Karen, no one cared about the neighborhood. Everyone just stayed inside and minded their own business. But now it feels like we're part of something. Like we're a community again." It wasn't just the park getting a makeover. There was a new sense of unity in the air. People were speaking up about the things that mattered to them, whether it was about keeping the neighborhood safe, making improvements to shared spaces, or simply getting to know their neighbors better. That night, the neighborhood held a small celebration at the park. I walked over, my dog still on a leash, and saw a small crowd gathered under a string of fairy lights, enjoying hot dogs, music, and games. I smiled as I saw familiar faces, people I had barely spoken to before Karen's reign, but now we were all connected by a shared sense of freedom and belonging. The next day, the board reached out to me with a request. They wanted me to consider running for a position, anything that would give me a say in how the neighborhood was shaped moving forward. I hadn't planned on getting that involved, but seeing the change, hearing the enthusiasm, and knowing that I had helped bring this transformation about, it was hard to say no. So I agreed. Months passed, and the transformation within Simmons Valley was nothing short of remarkable. The neighborhood that once lived under the shadow of Karen Whitmore's iron rule had now become a place where residents felt empowered, where community was more than just a buzzword. It was a living, breathing part of the neighborhood's DNA. I had taken a position on the HOA board, not as president, but as an active participant in the Community Relations Committee. My role was to help ensure that the neighborhood's voice was always heard and respected, no more backdoor deals, no more hidden agendas. It felt like we were all part of something much bigger than just our individual properties. I've been fighting not just for my own rights, but for the rights of every resident who had been pushed around by Karen and the corrupt board. Now we had a real chance to rebuild things the right way. The new board pushed forward with plans for sustainable community growth. They launched initiatives to improve energy efficiency, promote local businesses, and even held a neighborhood talent showcase to give people the chance to show off their unique skills. One of the biggest successes was the Simmons Valley Youth Mentorship Program. Local teens were paired with older residents who had professional experience, from electricians to chefs to computer scientists. It gave kids a chance to gain valuable skills and knowledge from those who had been around longer and learned how to make a living. It wasn't just a project, it was a true community effort to invest in the next generation. And the park? It wasn't just a gathering place anymore. It had become the heart of the community, a place where people from all walks of life could come together, share a meal, talk, and plan the next steps in our neighborhood's revival. The once-forgotten community center had been completely renovated and turned into a multi-purpose hub, hosting classes, workshops, and even a weekly farmers market. People started coming to Simmons Valley not just because they live here, but because it had become a place people wanted to be. I took a step back one evening, sitting on a bench in the park, watching a group of kids play soccer while their parents laughed and chatted nearby. I felt a sense of pride I hadn't experienced in a long time. This wasn't just about winning against Karen. It was about changing the system, about taking what had been broken and making it into something that truly served the people. We had succeeded in taking back control. And as I looked around, I knew the truth. We weren't just rebuilding Simmons Valley. We were rebuilding trust, hope, and a sense of community that could never be taken from us again. Just when it seemed like things were finally back on track, a community was flourishing again, I got another letter. This time, it wasn't from the HOA. This letter came from a developer. It was a proposal to buy a large chunk of land on the outskirts of our neighborhood, land that had been green space for as long as anyone could remember. It wasn't just any piece of land. It was a buffer zone, an area that protected our community from overdevelopment and preserved the natural beauty that made Simmons Valley so unique. The letter was slick and professionally written, touting the developer's plans to build luxury apartments, a shopping complex, and other upscale amenities that would supposedly improve the neighborhood. I read it twice, my mind racing. They were planning to turn our sanctuary into another concrete jungle. What's worse, the HOA board, despite the reforms we had fought for, had given this developer a seat at the table during the town meetings, likely with no real opposition. The letter mentioned that this land had been identified as prime for commercial development in the new HOA growth plan. My gut told me this wasn't just a bad idea, it was a threat to everything we'd worked for. I wasn't about to let it happen. I immediately called a meeting with the new HOA board. As I walked into the room, I could already see the tension in the air. Some of the board members who had joined after the Karen debacle were visibly uneasy. Others, I could tell, were still hesitant about standing up against powerful developers. I slammed the letter down on the table. "This is happening," I said, my voice firm. "A developer is trying to buy and destroy our green space. They're attempting to turn this community into a profit machine, and we can't let them." One of the newer board members, Lori, looked concerned. "But the developer's offering a lot of money, and the new amenities could really bring in business. Business at what cost?" I cut her off. "Once that land is gone, it's gone forever. We won't just lose green space. We'll lose the very thing that makes this community special." A few other residents had begun to file in, overhearing the conversation. The room was getting packed again, just like when Karen had tried to take over. And for a moment, I wondered if we were really ready for this kind of fight again. But when I looked around, I saw the same fire in people's eyes, the same determination that had taken Karen down. We had become a force, and I wasn't going to let these developers take what was ours. I knew the battle wasn't going to be easy, but I also knew that we had something powerful on our side: community support. This wasn't just about stopping a development project. It was about preserving what made Simmons Valley home. I called for an emergency neighborhood meeting. This time, the turnout was overwhelming. It wasn't just a handful of residents. It was every neighbor who had fought for this place, who had seen what could happen if we let our guard down. The stakes were higher than ever. As I walked into the community center, I saw families, young professionals, retirees. Everyone who had been a part of our transformation was there. It felt like everyone was ready to fight for what they loved about the community. I stepped up to the front, took a deep breath, and started speaking. We've all worked too hard to let someone come in and destroy our home. They want to buy our green space, pave it over, and turn it into luxury condos. But that's not who we are, and that's not what we want. We want a community that values nature, values connection, and values the people who live here. The crowd murmured in agreement. I could see people nodding, getting fired up. They knew exactly what this was about. "But it's not enough just to be angry," I continued. "We need a plan. We need to show these developers, the HOA, and anyone who stands in our way that we will not back down. This land isn't for sale." I then outlined our next steps. Organize a petition to demonstrate the widespread opposition to the development. Reach out to local media to ensure that this wasn't swept under the rug. Work with environmental and historical preservation groups to make sure we had the legal support to block this development. It wasn't long before the crowd broke out into small groups, each one brainstorming and planning the next move. The energy in the room was electric. Everyone was mobilized, ready to act. In the following days, the petition spread like wildfire. Neighbors went door to door, asking for signatures. Others shared it online, flooding social media with posts and videos about what was happening. The petition quickly gained hundreds of signatures, and the message was loud and clear. The community was united. But that wasn't all. We also started reaching out to local media outlets, and within a few days, news trucks were parked outside the HOA office, interviewing residents, asking the tough questions, and shedding light on the situation. It didn't take long before the story was all over the local news. Simmons Valley fights back. Community unites against developers' takeover. Even the local environmental groups, hearing about our fight, rallied behind us. They offered legal advice and promised to provide expert testimony if it came down to a courtroom battle. It didn't take long for the developer to realize that they had underestimated us. After our petition went viral, after the news coverage spread, and after local environmental groups started showing their support, the developer started to sweat. The flood of calls, emails, and protest signs outside their office grew to a level they clearly weren't prepared for. I got a call one afternoon from the developer's legal team. They wanted to set up a meeting to discuss how we could come to a mutual agreement. At first, I thought they might offer a compromise. Maybe they'd scale down the development plans or find a way to get community buy-in. But when we met in person, I quickly realized this was more about damage control than negotiation. The representative from the developer sat across from me, his posture stiff and formal, a little too rehearsed. He cleared his throat and then said, "Mr. Callahan, we understand there's been some resistance to our project. However, we believe this development is in the best interest of the community. More homes, more businesses, more revenue." I didn't let him finish. I stood up and laid everything I had in front of him. The petition with over 600 signatures. The news articles showing how the community was rallying. The backing of environmental organizations willing to fight the project in court. Photos of the green space, the native wildlife, and the community park that would be demolished if their plans went forward. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. The evidence was on the table, and it spoke volumes. "This isn't just about buildings," I said calmly. "This is about the people who live here. You're proposing to take away something we've fought to protect. You'll have a long battle ahead if you try to force this development through." The developer's representative looked at the pile of documents, then at me, and finally backed down at the table. His shoulders slumped slightly, and I could see the realization dawning on him. We weren't going to back down. He sighed. "We understand your position, Mr. Callahan. We'll need some time to reevaluate our options." A part of me wanted to press harder, but I already knew what this was. The pressure we'd applied was too much for them to ignore. They could either back off or risk a public relations nightmare and a lengthy legal battle. They were starting to fold. A few days after my meeting with a developer, we got the news we'd all been waiting for. The developer, facing mounting pressure from the community, the media, and the growing legal threats, had decided to halt their plans. They issued a public statement announcing they were withdrawing their proposal to develop the green space. It was a victory, not just for me, but for every single person in Simmons Valley who had stood up and refused to let the developers destroy what we had built together. But that wasn't all. The HOA board convened for an emergency meeting to discuss the fallout. With the developer retreating, they were forced to confront the fact that they backed a project that was wildly unpopular and had placed our community's future in jeopardy. Karen, who had long been out of the picture, had managed to leave behind a legacy of chaos, but the new board now had the chance to rewrite that history. They voted to establish new, more stringent guidelines for development proposals, requiring community input and a supermajority vote before any project could move forward. The neighborhood celebrated, but it wasn't just about stopping the development. It was about proving that we were a community, a true community that cared more about preserving our shared values than making a quick profit. A week later, the neighborhood threw a celebration at the community park, complete with live music, food trucks, and a huge bonfire. It was a thank you party for everyone who had fought, signed petitions, and spread the word. It wasn't just a win for me or the board. It was a win for everyone who lived here. That night, I stood by the bonfire, surrounded by neighbors I had come to consider family, and I couldn't help but smile. It was incredible to see how far we had come, from fighting fines and fighting corruption to standing together as a community, stronger than ever before. And for the first time in years, Simmons Valley wasn't just a place on the map. It was a place where people cared about their homes, their neighbors, and their shared future. We had fought for our community, and now we could finally say, with confidence, that no one would take it away.